Hi, my name is Christopher Drost and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about gender dysphoria and what you should know about it as a writer. While I was researching this video, I was reminded constantly of how important it is that I make these videos, and specifically for writers, because I do know that everybody can do research. It's just that when I use very basic search terms like gender dysphoria, transgender, things like that, what pops up constantly is not actually good information. The problem is that when I go through the research, I know, oh hey, this has a bias or this doesn't have a bias. But the thing is, if you're a writer and you don't have any basis, like me, I have gender dysphoria. So I kind of already know a little bit about it, so that makes it easier to select the right information. But first, we gotta do the disclaimers, because I love disclaimers apparently now. First disclaimer, I am going to use a lot of terminology. Terminology is moving very, very fast and constantly evolving on this issue. There is not even a consensus on even the most basic terms. So what I did for this video is I took the definitions that resonate the most with me. But there is some slight variation in different views on certain words. In this video I will be mostly aiming to at least be internally consistent, because that is the only thing I have control over, really. Disclaimer number 2 is that I am in no way trying to discredit non-binary people who do not experience gender dysphoria. Today I am just talking about gender dysphoria and what it means in a medical sense. Disclaimer number 3. I will be using the binary for both biological sex and gender, but keep in mind that whenever I talk in this binary system, I do mean that it is a spectrum. This is just to simplify the situation to make it easier to understand. If you understand this part, you can add in that it is actually a spectrum. Yeah, that's about enough disclaimers. Let's get on with the video. So, what is gender dysphoria? Simply put, gender dysphoria is the diagnosis you get if you walk into a gender clinic and you tell them, hey, I feel like I am not in the right body. Let's start at a very basic thing that you need to understand in order to know what gender dysphoria is. There's a difference between gender and biological sex. Biological sex is basically just your body. It is the chromosomes you have. Do you have female or male chromosomes? Primary and secondary sex characteristics. So think about things like that. It's what you see on the outside. Gender, on the other hand, is something that is in your brain. I like to think of gender as brain sex, because gender does have a biological basis, but it is also how you feel. Your biological sex and your gender, when you're cisgender, they're both male or both female. So if you're a trans guy, you were born with a female body, but you have a male brain. And if you're a trans woman, you have a male body with a female brain. There is such a thing as a male and a female brain. I will get into that in more detail later on in the series, when I'm actually going to show you all the sciencey things and actual research papers and that kind of thing. When you're transgender, your brain is more like the brain of the gender that you identify with than your biological sex. This is also the reason why I get really pissed off when somebody's holding a gender reveal party of their baby. You can do a biological sex reveal party, but not an actual gender reveal party, because you don't know the gender of your child yet. Gender identity doesn't fully form until you're 4 to 5 years old. About gender dysphoria, there is a lot being thrown around. A lot of the time you will hear people say that gender dysphoria is a mental illness or a mental disorder. To talk about mental illness first, a mental illness is defined either so broadly or so specifically that under the broad term, it could be a mental illness for some people, but under the more narrow term, even depression doesn't fall under mental illness. So that is just a question of what definition you use. I will link a video down below that talks a little bit more about that. When it comes to gender dysphoria being a disorder, I know that the DSM is a book of disorders, but there is multiple kinds of disorders in the DSM. For example, ADHD and autism are neurological disorders. Gender dysphoria in that sense is closer to autism and ADHD because that also is more neurological disorder than it is a mental disorder. As a matter of fact, the DSM-4 had the diagnosis gender identity disorder. This one was dropped from the DSM-4, and in DSM-5 when it came out, it became gender dysphoria. So the term disorder is not even in the name anymore. How is gender dysphoria diagnosed? Well, this is actually the phase that I am right now. I am waiting for a second opinion, and after I pass that with flying colors, I'm sure, I'll be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. This part is you talk to a shrink, there is no blood test, there is no brain scan, there is nothing they can do to diagnose gender dysphoria except just listen to the person who has gender dysphoria. Once you have the diagnosis, there's only one thing you can do to alleviate gender dysphoria, and that is medically transition. It is not like everybody starts at the same point and they end at the same point. You can have a lot of different treatments and a lot of different choices when it comes to what your medical transition will look like. I am going to talk about trans guys now because I am more knowledgeable about that part. For trans guys, sometimes just hormones is enough. Sometimes top surgery and hormones is enough. But some do need lower surgery. There is a whole bunch of things that you can do. And every trans person will take at every step they take, they will take into consideration how much risk there is and if they're willing to take that to alleviate more symptoms of the gender dysphoria. I covered what gender dysphoria means in a medical sense. Now, that is all great, but what does it mean for the individual? Well, I just thought I would talk about what gender dysphoria means for me and some of my experiences. One of the things that I think is really not understood by cisgender people is that gender dysphoria, it fluctuates. So it's always in my mind because, I live in this body and it can be pretty annoying. It's always there, but sometimes it just feels more persistent than other times. It is a little bit like something big like financial problems. When you have financial trouble, it is always there in the back of your mind. But sometimes randomly it will flare up and suddenly it will really worry you. That is also a little bit how dysphoria works. It's always there, it's always on your mind, but when certain things happen, it is almost like you're reminded of it, or it just comes back with a vengeance or something. Like, hey, I'm doing great, and then suddenly, bam! No, not doing great. For example, to get ahead of myself a little bit for the pronoun video, pronouns can be very triggering because it's very confronting that something as easy as language can trigger such a horrible feeling. I really wanted to describe how it feels to have gender dysphoria, but I had to stop filming for a while and sit down and really give it some thought because as I was talking, I realized that it's really hard for me to explain what I'm feeling. So I made a metaphor that I think will be the closest to something that cisgender people will also understand. Because otherwise I'm going like, hey, what if you would always be called ma'am while you're really a sir, or the other way around? And you would go like, yeah, what? So what about it? Well, for me, that is like the most cringy feeling in the world and makes me feel really bad. And most people don't understand that. So I can't use real life examples by just turning it around. So what I came up with is that gender dysphoria feels like you are in a room full of people. But those people don't see you. And they are talking to you, but they don't see you. They see someone else. You are someone else. And you're constantly trying to let them know who you are, but they don't see you. And the worst part about it is, like when you look in the mirror, you don't see yourself either. So what does dysphoria mean in daily life? Well, for every transgender person, dysphoria means something else. I'm gonna share some personal things for that. Let's just start with this channel. I don't do the editing of my videos because I can't stand the sound of my own voice. So when I talk, my voice sounds lower to me. Like, I think that's for everyone, but to me, in my head, my voice sounds a little bit lower. When I look at the video, I hear my voice, and it is triggering a lot of dysphoria for me. Although I can look it back once or twice, maybe, I can't go through the process of actually editing the video myself. So fortunately, I'm lucky enough to have a girlfriend who does that for me. What also is a point for me is that I have a bullet journal, and I am a fairly creative person, so I draw in my bullet journal. The thing is that, you know, you end up always drawing girly things. And although I'm not ashamed that I do this, it does trigger dysphoria. So bullet journaling is not always something I can do. Another hobby that I have is horse riding. I have been riding horses since I was 9 years old. That is also something I do not talk about anymore and that I don't do anymore. Well, also because it's an expensive hobby. So if I had the money to do it right now, I would not go horse riding. Because this also is an activity, although I enjoyed it and I am not ashamed of it, and I also don't think it makes me less of a man. It still triggers dysphoria for me at this point. These are just things that I have to see what I gain versus what I lose. Another issue that I have in daily life is that I prefer not to make phone calls. It is very distressing for me to be constantly gendered as female. And I also get into this constant loop with people like, hey, is your husband there? No, you're talking to Chris. No, I need you, your husband. Is your husband? No, you are talking to me. Ma'am, is your husband home? Really? And on really bad days, it can happen that I need to go out of the house and I really, really don't want to. And sometimes it actually does happen that the dysphoria flares up so high that I just stay inside. So I have minimal other people to deal with. The last thing I want to talk about is mental health. I feel like writers especially need to know a little bit more about it. There are a couple of mental health issues that correlate with being transgender. The first one is depression and the second one is anxiety. Those two things correlate. This is not a causation. It's not you are trans, so you are depressed. No, this works a little bit differently. When you look at all the trans people and how many of them experience mental health issues like anxiety and depression, you will see a significant correlation. I do need to point out that if you split up these numbers, if you are transgender and your environment is supportive, the numbers drop down to normal rates for the overall population. Let's work with an example that feels very extreme to me, but is very real. Among transgender people, the suicide rates are much higher than the normal population. You will find in trans men, for example, a little over 50% has attempted suicide in the span of his life. When you take the environment into consideration, you will see a very steep divide. Transgender people who have the support of their environment, so friends and family, work environment, general vicinity, they have suicide rates much more comparable to the suicide rates among the general population. While if there is no support system in place, the suicide rate skyrockets to sometimes even 80%, depending on how bad it is. I think this is important for writers to know, because if you look at the stats that I gave you in the first, you will write a very different character. So maybe you would accidentally end up writing a character that is very supported but still has depression, which is much more unlikely than an unsupported character. In the end, it is not entirely impossible to write a character like this, but it is much less realistic than you may think. So that's all I've got for you today. Usually this is the part where I go like, hey, the question of the day is, but it is sort of after midnight, I'm really tired and I just want to go to bed, really. So, okay, so last night the camera rudely cut me off. The camera decided it was enough, and let's face it, it was pretty late. So, good morning. As for the question of today, was this video helpful? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays. Yo, get me coffee.